Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amber Mace, and I am the Executive Director of the California Council on Science and Technology. We are here today to talk about disasters and talk about what happens when they co-occur, when they stack on top of each other, when they have compounding effects. This is one of a series of briefings we've been doing on disasters. We've talked about wildfires, we've talked about heat, now we're talking about it all together. I'm going to start out by telling you a little bit about the California Council on Science and Technology and our Disaster Resilience Initiative, and then we're going to introduce our panelists, our three experts today, and jump right into the conversation. Please do weigh in with your questions. You can write those into the question function, and we will do our best to get to them. First of all, CCST as an organization was created at the request of California state policymakers. They wanted to make sure that we as a state have access to science and technology advice from the wealth of academic research institutions in California. So much knowledge is created here, and California policymakers want to make sure they have access to it. So we are here as an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit to serve as a translator, as a connector between policymakers in the governor's office, in the legislature, in the executive branch, and the network of experts that we have in California and beyond. We are very lucky that California has these resources, and CCST has been proud to partner with many of the academic and research institutions in California, including the University of California system, the California State University system, our community college system, Stanford, Caltech, Department of Energy labs, including Berkeley Lab, Sandia, SLAC, and Livermore Lab, as well as NASA Ames and NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratories. These provide the backbone of our network of expertise, and we can reach into their institutions and beyond to make these connections. These briefings are an example of how we make these connections, to think about what policymakers need and how we can bring in experts to have conversations like we're having today. We also can deliver peer-reviewed reports, we can host workshops, and we have a fellowship program, which is a really direct way of delivering science and technology advice. We have this fellowship program where we deliver PhD scientists and engineers from across the country for a year of public service and leadership training. In fact, you're hearing from one of our alums today on the panel. So now CCST is focusing in, and we are thinking very deliberately about disasters, disaster resilience, how we can help bring science and technology advice to inform how California can better prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. And boy, we have been experiencing a lot of them. These disasters are disruptive, they're harmful, and they create opportunities for us, opportunities to rethink how we live in society and how we operate, how we can harness science and technology. And we can also think about these science and technological innovations bringing better resilience and sustainability, while also acknowledging that to some degree, they can also exacerbate inequities, or they can create privacy problems or security issues. And so we want to be aware of all of these factors, and we want to be aware of how we can build this resilience in a way that is equitable, that is accessible, and helpful for all Californians. And so today, I am delighted that we have three experts with us to talk explicitly about how disasters can intersect and what happens when they do. What do we know about this? What have we learned from the past? What do we still need to know to do better? Because we know with climate change, these disasters follow each other. They happen in sequence, they compound and exacerbate the response. So without further ado, I am delighted to welcome our panelists so we can jump right into the conversation. And first up, I would like to have Dr. Michael Mendez introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Amber, thank you for the warm welcome, and it's such a pleasure to be speaking with legislative and all other policy and community experts and interest groups on this important issue of the compounding of disasters And thank you to CCST for convening this important expert and policy briefing. I'm Assistant Professor of Environmental Planning and Policy at the University of California, Irvine, where I specialize on issues of climate change, public health, and specifically environmental justice. How are environmental hazards and disasters disproportionately affecting low-income communities of color? And my research related to wildfires or extreme wildfires in many cases here in California is focused on the most marginalized, most stigmatized population in California, undocumented migrants, particularly migrants working in the fields, farm workers. So my research really takes a strong approach of thinking beyond property values and loss and taking a strong people and equity-centered approach to disaster planning, policy, recovery efforts. And it's important to note that disasters, as it was mentioned briefly, that disasters only exacerbate existing inequalities that we experience in our society. And particularly for undocumented migrants in Sonoma County, where I'm currently doing field research again, thankfully, because of our vaccinations, and other places like the Central Coast, that these individuals have a pre-disaster marginalized status. And this disaster only exacerbates existing inequalities. So if we really want to address disaster risk reduction, it starts with the social integration of migrants before a disaster. So I'm looking forward to talking about the unique experiences and impacts happening to migrants here in California, and how can we do better in terms of the context of compounding disasters such as heat, wildfires, and pandemics. And look forward to further having that conversation and discussing policy recommendations. And I put in the chat a 2-page policy brief, as well as my recently published article I did with community groups on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Nicole Meyer-Morse.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. And I just wanted to thank Amber and the CCST staff for inviting me to participate in this panel. As Amber mentioned, I am an alum of the CCST Fellowship Program. In that program, I was placed in the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, where I started my career as an emergency management specialist. In that role, I was the science and technology advisor, which means I worked on a whole host of various projects. And one thing that is relevant to this conversation is I worked on identifying innovative mitigation projects. And when we talk about mitigation from the emergency management perspective, unlike other disciplines, it's not necessarily about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but rather reducing risk to future disasters. So I specifically focused on some really difficult disasters that California is impacted by, which include drought, sea level rise, and wildfire mitigation. I was in that position for about 3.5 years, and then I transitioned to work for FEMA. I currently work in the Consolidated Resource Center West in Sacramento. This Consolidated Resource Center supports public assistance, which is FEMA's largest grant program, which is utilized to rebuild communities after federally declared disasters occur.
Thank you, Nicole. Now, Dr. Stephen Wong.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Wong. I am a research and development engineer. I kind of wear 2 different hats. The first is at the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies, and the second is with the Transportation Sustainability Research Center at UC Berkeley. My research is focused in on the transportation side and specifically on evacuations. A lot of my research is focused on how evacuees make decisions and how we can, using that information, we can help build policies as well as strategies to respond in those situations when it comes to transportation. The second part of my research focuses on how we could share resources in evacuations. Oftentimes, public agencies are overwhelmed in disasters, and we need to be thinking about alternative resources to be able to assist people. And that comes through the share economy, whether that be through private citizens or private companies as well. And so that's really the 2 parts of my research, but I'm really also strongly interested in how we can be increasing compliance to mandatory evacuation orders, reducing congestion in evacuation situations, as well as increasing equity, specifically for those who don't have the resources to be able to evacuate, as Michael had mentioned in his introduction. I'm very excited to be presenting here and sitting on this panel, and thank you so much to CCST for inviting me to be here. And I'm excited to be presenting my research as well as answering the questions. And I'll be putting a few things in the chat. The first is a playbook for COVID-19 and evacuation, so one of the compounding disasters that has been going on. And I'll also be putting down a review of recent California wildfires and some of the work that we found, including recommendations specifically geared towards policy and strategies to help agencies, both at the local level as all the way up to state level. And then also a personal website with more research if you're interested.
Wonderful. Well, so much expertise already and a lot to cover. So I'm going to jump right in with the first question to you, Stephen. And while I ask you this question, for all of you who've joined us today, please do use the Q&A function to write in your questions. We will do our best to get to them. So Stephen, can you talk a little bit about how these disasters are interacting in California, these wildfires, extreme heat events, power outages, COVID-19 all together? How are they affecting Californians?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question to be thinking about, and it's something that has come up particularly more recently, as we've seen. I think a great example of this was, and unfortunate in terms of the impact, was the 2020 California lightning wildfires that occurred in August at the same time as COVID-19. That was at the same time as we had rolling blackouts, as well as a heat wave, as well as the smoke leading from the wildfires impacting communities. And sometimes, in many cases, that smoke was impacting communities that were already at a higher risk for COVID-19. And so all this is happening at the same time. On my side, when I look at the evacuation side, is that people were having to make decisions that were really difficult and having to think about trade-offs between disasters that they should never have to make. And that was between, for example, a wildfire approaching and COVID-19, and perhaps going to a public shelter where they might be exposed to COVID-19. And so I think that's a really clear example of how it's affecting Californians, and that they have to be making these unfortunate trade-offs. And we have to be thinking about strategies to reduce the risk, whether it be from the wildfire side, on the COVID-19 side, or whatever the combination of disasters are, or both of them at the same time, and thinking about kind of a more all hazards approach, as well as still getting the nuances of each disaster. And so the impacts are great, and they're going to just continue to increase, especially in ways that we might not even be thinking about. And as one last example is the public safety power shutoff events, which are a mitigation tool to reduce wildfire risk, but can actually act in some cases as a compounding disaster, especially if a wildfire is still sparked and we lose communication and other types of electrified mechanisms to be able to respond to a disaster. That presents a compounding scenario. We have to be thinking about making our mitigation strategies resilient as well.
Can you say more about that particular example as it relates to transportation infrastructure and evacuations?
Yeah, when it comes to transportation, so when we lose electricity in these power safety shutoff events, one of the key issues is communication. Not all communication facilities have backup generators or are able to have their own power source. And as a result, we see situations where people may not receive a mandatory evacuation order or even be told where a wildfire is. And then also, as we electrify our transportation, we're going to continue to rely on electricity over time. And when we lose power in these types of events, we're going to have a resilience issue. People may not be able to evacuate. People may not be able to recover. And so that kind of intersection of those two issues is really important, especially as transportation electrifies, which is really critical for California's greenhouse gas emission goals and reaching carbon neutrality. But when we think about the sustainability angle, we also have to think about the resilience angle at the same time in that conversation, so that we produce co-benefits, not any type of tension.
Really excellent points. I have more questions about transportation, but before we get to those, I want to come to Michael and have you talk. You mentioned in your introduction that you're focused on how these intersecting disasters disproportionately affect lower income communities of color. Can you talk about that and give us some examples of what you've been seeing?
Sure, I have two research sites. In the link I put the first published research. We looked at the Thomas Fire, which happened in 2017, 2018 in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. And I say that the 2 years because it lasted 40 days, started in December, lasted until mid-January. And up until recently, it was the second largest wildfire in California's history. And then in August 2020, the Sonoma Napa fires displaced it by 3 or 4 other wildfires, extreme wildfire events. And so my new research is now looking at Sonoma County, particularly the impacts to undocumented migrants. And sort of the impacts that we often see is in terms of language injustice, ensuring that that the information on emergency evacuation, sheltering, disaster assistance funds are translated easily and the most commonly spoken language in the region, particularly for workers. This also has emergency boil alerts, power shutoff information, but we saw at least in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, as well as Sonoma County, that these live translations were not happening. For instance, in Ventura, they did not have live translations until about 5 days later from when the fire started. Cal OES, I believe, loaned some information officers that spoke Spanish to do live translation. In the meantime, migrant rights groups and environmental justice groups had to do all the translation either through social media, their low power wattage radio station, or other types of social media apps like WhatsApp. Ventura did not hire anyone until about a year later. And this is California. And it's still quite unbelievable that some counties that are experiencing these wildfires don't have live translation. And that needs to change. Second is the issue of occupational health and safety. Oftentimes, these migrant workers are asked to labor in hazardous conditions that are considered hazardous to the general population. Specifically here in Sonoma, access permit verification permits are issued by the agriculture commissioner, and this occurs in other counties as well, to allow these workers to enter into these mandatory evacuation zones that are considered hazardous to the general population. There's no emergency planning. If the air quality should get hazardous, too hazardous for the workers, how would they escape in a timely fashion? There's no post-exposure health monitoring for these individuals that are laboring in conditions that not only they're getting all the soot through the respiratory systems, but some workers have told me that they have black saliva from these conditions. And sort of who's monitoring? There's no official monitors of this type of work. And for instance, in Ventura County, when the Thomas Fire occurred, Cal OSHA, that's the state's Occupational Health and Safety Office, had a regional office there, and they shut down their office because it was too dangerous for their local workers, the investigators. And they didn't reopen it until about 4 days later, after several Latino caucus members in Sacramento from the Legislative Caucus pressured the Cal OSHA to reopen that office and do inspections. So those are just some of the key issues, along with ineligibility of undocumented migrants for federal disaster relief funds and the lack of funding to assist these individuals.
Thank you for that. And Michael, I want to come back to you in a little bit and have you talk specifically about some of the lessons that we've learned from previous disasters and how those have informed future disasters. Nicole, I'd love to turn to you from your perspective and your experience at the state level and the federal level. How have these intersecting and compounding disasters affected disaster response? How have they complicated the response landscape?
Well, first, I want to apologize if there's noise in the background. I think this is what happens when we all work from home. But yeah, I think, COVID has really kind of opened our eyes to all the difficulties that can kind of collide when we have compounding disasters. And basically, when we have these types of compounding disasters, they're force multipliers. And it can, impact our ability to respond appropriately and as quickly as we would like. A kind of straightforward example that comes to mind is during an extreme heat event, you may have power outages. And traditionally, what we would do is, communities would identify cooling centers for individuals who don't have access to cooler temperatures. But in COVID, we can't necessarily, house people in these kind of congregate cooling centers. And so what do we do? Fortunately for COVID, we were able to house individuals who required shelter in non-congregate sheltering situations. But again, that requires, a federal disaster declaration. So similarly, if communities are evacuated in a fire, we have to be able to identify these kinds of solutions in compounding disasters. But I think, what we can learn from it is that we need to really kind of identify innovative solutions to prepare ourselves for these compounding disasters, because they will continue to happen. And, disasters are continuing to increase in frequency and intensity. And I would be shocked to see if we don't have more compounding disasters. And so if we don't have this kind of outside of the box thinking of how we're going to respond, we will be potentially slower in our response.
Yeah, absolutely. And Michael, you mentioned something that, and this is going back to, actually I want to have Stephen weigh in on something that you mentioned, Michael, which is about this, when infrastructure, when some of our key response people aren't available because they've been evacuated or have to shut down to some degree. And Stephen, this is a question about our transportation infrastructure. Not everybody has a vehicle and can evacuate. So how do we talk about what happens when the people who are driving the buses and operating our transportation infrastructure also have to evacuate? What happens, is talk about the equity issues associated with this and how we deal with it.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think it's very complex. Operators have families that they also need to assist and evacuate, and they need to protect themselves as well. I think a lot of it in coming down in terms of recommendations is in order to build these public transit evacuation plans. Currently, the way most public transit agencies operate is in these disasters, they provide an ad hoc service. So if someone might perhaps need assistance, they might be able to get it through a public transit agency, but it's not necessarily a plan that is public or has been vetted or has been developed ahead of time. And that kind of goes towards evacuation planning in general, that California doesn't necessarily have, not every jurisdiction has an evacuation plan, especially a detailed one that is able to not just deal with wildfires, but any other type of disaster, including a multi-hazard approach. When it comes to the equity impacts, though, especially for those who don't have vehicles, public transit can sometimes be their only option. But that's some of the research that I've been also doing, is to think about alternative ways. If public transit agencies and operators are unavailable because they have to evacuate themselves, how do we set up a system in which we have private residents, your neighbor, to be able to assist in the evacuation process, to provide that spare seat that you have in the back of your car? Instead of taking more luggage, for example, how about you knock on your neighbor's door and provide that assistance? And so it's this resource sharing that's really important, but you have to create that framework ahead of time, and you have to be able to start that conversation within the community. That's not something that happens out of thin air. In some cases it does, but you still need to be promoting that and developing that as well. So I think there's a lot of important steps that need to be taken in order to increase accessibility and mobility for those who either don't have a vehicle or who just don't have reliable access to a vehicle. Perhaps their vehicle is in the shop in most days. So that's just another example of how this could occur, as well as people who may have a vehicle but have limited mobility and are unable to use their vehicle.
Right. And you just talked about the importance of community and individuals working together. And Michael, I want to come back to you and have you talk about what we've learned and the infrastructure that had been put in place from a previous disaster that really helped build that trust, that helped us and the community respond to a subsequent disaster.
Yes, first I'd like to touch a little bit on what Stephen and what you asked previously. These inequities that we're seeing happening to certain populations, particularly the most stigmatized populations, these disparate impacts don't happen by choice, just by accident, that is. They're happening because political choices are being made to intentionally withhold disaster planning and resources from undocumented migrants. And as we see that undocumented migrants are rendered invisible in the context of public policy and disaster response because of systemic racism and cultural norms of who is considered a worthy disaster victim. So similar to the homeless populations that we see in these compounding disasters, oftentimes undocumented immigrants are deemed unworthy of safeguarding and protection, and local government, state, as well as the federal government have intentionally decided to withhold these resources from these communities. So these disparate impacts are not by accident. Again, these are political choices. And for transportation, that's key. We saw here in Sonoma County that individuals could not escape the smoke because one, the electricity was shut off and gas stations were shut down, and many of these immigrants can't afford to have a full tank of gas and pay a high rate. So oftentimes they fill a quarter of a tank. So that really affects them during a disaster to be able to leave. Other instances in the Thomas Fire in Ventura and Santa Barbara County, the main arterial, the 101 freeway that connects many of the migrant workers in Ventura and Oxnard, was severed after the wildfires because of the torrential rains that happened and the mud flows that blocked out that whole freeway. So individuals that had more income could either rent a boat and go up to Santa Barbara, have car, pay gas, and drive around the mountain, or pay expensive Amtrak tickets. So often for migrant domestic service workers, that was not an option. So some of the community responses have been really to try to change these issues and to bring these migrants, their advocates, their groups into the fold in disaster planning before it happens. And it's quite challenging oftentimes because yes, local governments in particular are stressed and spread thin in terms of resources, but these are individuals that are part of a vital economy that maintains the stability of these regions. And they have existed in these areas for generations and decades, and just rendering them invisible is no longer politically acceptable, and there's more pressure to do this. And then also acknowledging that these undocumented migrants are all not Latino. Many of them are indigenous Oaxacan Mexicans that speak neither English nor Spanish, and many of them are illiterate. So really understanding that intersectional approach of how we deal with these special populations.
Do you have any, you suggested that there are some direct policy reasons why we are seeing some of this inequity. Do you have any policy recommendations you'd like to share?
First and foremost, language justice, ensuring that local governments hire live translators and interpreters during a disaster, and have that budgeted yearly, and including these special populations, these vulnerable populations ahead of disaster planning. The governor recently attached some government funding to that, as well as some legislation passed because of advocates pushing that forward. But there needs to be stronger language justice policy adopted at the local and the county levels. Another is a permanent disaster relief fund for undocumented migrants ineligible for federal aid. The governor, again, in a great move, did allocate almost $100 million for COVID-related funding, disaster relief fund, but that was expended almost immediately. So the need is still quite strong. Others is ensuring that when these farm workers enter into mandatory evacuation zones to pick the grapes or other types of crops to protect those crops from smoke and ash, that these workers are fully protected with the proper equipment, get hazard pay, as well as have adequate air quality monitorings that are real-time on-site. Many times the air quality monitoring that they're using are miles away that are stationary, nowhere near the work site. So those are some of the things that I have included in that a two-page policy brief, as well as the published article that I put in the chat.
Wonderful, thank you. Nicole, I'd like to turn to you. We've been hearing about how a lot of this has to do with different counties having different resources and different abilities to respond. Can you talk about and we know that all disasters are local, can you talk about the relationship and interactions between state, federal, and local entities in the disaster response landscape? What are some of the barriers? What are some of the opportunities?
Yeah, sure. So the way disaster response is set up is, as you mentioned, Amber, is all disasters are local. And the intent of this is to ensure that the state and the federal entities are not coming into a locality without a request and without needs identified. So that is how it works is, the locals say, this is the disaster, we've worked with our mutual aid partners, we're unable to respond to this need, and they elevate it to the state. And then the state then elevates it to the feds once the state is no longer able to meet the resource demands at the local level. But again, there is a very clear intention that disasters are to remain local, with the goal of identifying the resources that the locals need, as opposed to imposing what the feds or the state think is required to resolve the issue.
Can you say a little bit more about that and where you think we can do better, where you think we are doing really well and we do need to do more of with more investment?
I no longer work for the state. And I'm on the recovery side of things. So I would actually probably defer you to somebody who is more intimately involved with the current protocol and procedures, as I would feel probably I wouldn't be qualified to give you an accurate response there.
No problem. I totally get it. Thank you for that. And Stephen, I'd like to come back to you when you've already shared a lot about the nature of evacuation and response. Can you say a little bit more about who complies when they receive an evacuation order and what are some of the constraints around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when it comes to compliance, we need to we should start thinking about different groups of people and how they respond. And that's a lot of my research, is to understand how different people will react to a mandatory evacuation order, as well as if they actually choose to evacuate or stay. And I use a lot of it's called discrete choice modeling or econometrics to understand those factors at a statistically significant level to determine if you do receive a mandatory evacuation order, are you more likely to actually evacuate? When it comes to these compliance, the good news is for California is that in my research, we found that compliance to mandatory evacuation orders for wildfires tends to be very high, upwards of 85 to 90%, and that's comparatively to hurricanes, which are usually more around 50, even sometimes sub 50% in terms of compliance. But there's still a sizable number of people who, when they receive a mandatory evacuation order, still decide not to leave. The other issue on the flip side, though, is that some people just don't receive one. And that's for a variety of reasons, whether that be because they don't have access to communication or technology, they don't have a smartphone, or they didn't sign up for the opt-in system that many jurisdictions use when it comes to emergency notifications. There's also issues when it comes to people not complying with the mandatory evacuation orders because they physically cannot leave the evacuation zone. They have mobility challenges. Perhaps they're homebound and they don't have the resources to be able to evacuate. And again, kind of back to some of the comments I made before regarding carless individuals who don't have reliable access to a vehicle. And there's also people who don't comply with mandatory evacuation orders because they just don't have the monetary funds. They don't have an emergency pool of cash to be able to stay somewhere. They might not even know where they can go shelter, for example. And if that shelter will even accept them, kind of going a little bit when it comes to Michael's research, and that there's a fear of going to public shelters because of the information that they may have to provide, or even the cost of public shelters, even though they typically are free. And so these are just a variety of reasons why people decide not to comply with mandatory evacuation orders. So it's kind of twofold. We have to think about the communication side, but then also the resource side as well. People can't evacuate if they don't know a fire is coming. And so that's a really important aspect when it comes to this work. And also when it comes to the public safety power shutoff events, if we don't have that communication, people aren't going to know to be able to evacuate. And we're going to see a lot of challenges when it comes to that as well. And this compliance issue is not just a wildfire issue, it's all hazards, and so that's going to only increase when it comes to compounding disasters.
How much of this I'd like to hear some recommendations from you of what we can do to better understand this particular aspect of response. You say that with wildfires, we have much higher response, at least from what we know, than say hurricanes. What do we know about that? What other data do we need? How do we learn from what's happening? Are we paying attention in the right way when a disaster occurs to collect the data we need to better inform what we do in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Michael will also be able to provide some background on this and the challenges of collecting data following disasters. I think oftentimes we don't, as researchers, we don't have the funds or the time at that point in time to be able to conduct this really actionable research that happens very rapidly. There's no real mechanism that California has to be able to conduct that research very, very quickly. To be able to gather that data that is perishable, that we won't have in 8 to 12 months. A lot of that data is lost, and we can't learn from the lessons that what either went well or went wrong. There are many disasters that I really strongly believe we should have data coming out of, but I haven't had the opportunity to be able to collect it just because it's so overwhelming. Just the sheer number and the complexity of these types of events. And I'm sure Michael has that same challenges as well when it comes to data collection and ensuring that there is also equitable representation within our data as well.
Michael?
No, I would wholeheartedly agree about that, the issue of representation and the speed and representativeness of academic research. So my recently published study and my studies going forward have been co-authored with community groups that are on the front lines of these disasters, such as migrant rights groups, indigenous migrant rights groups, as well as labor and environmental justice groups that are on the ground and providing access and key narratives and information, sort of that lived experience of what has happened over multiple years of extreme wildfire events. And again, I use that word extreme wildfire events intentionally because places like Sonoma and Ventura counties are experiencing these uncontrollable, unpredictable type of fires that we have never really seen before, that are lasting a lot longer and almost year round. So it's quite important to be able to work with these community groups, have them have ownership of the data and the research, and to be able to speak for themselves, speak for in their own right. And we actually had a much more powerful sort of unveiling of the research and decimation of the research because of that community action-oriented type of research. From being able to work directly with Cal OES, the state legislature, NOAA, as well as NCAR, these scientific bodies at the federal level that do the modeling in terms of air quality and other kind of geospatial type of data, but they really want to get that ground truth. And what does that data that's so high level look on the ground? So we believe that we were the first to ever publish on that perspective of wildfire disaster from an undocumented migrant perspective. So, and policy recommendation from research to state, federal, and local policy implementation must be done in a collaborative process, because these individuals that are on the front lines, living year after year and nearly year-round fire season, as well as other compounding disasters, have become experts in their own right because they have to fill vital government gaps when the government has not stepped up at all levels. They're the ones learning how to get this information and resources and other safeguard sort of activities to these most vulnerable and stigmatized populations.
Yeah, thank you. Really excellent points, both of you. Nicole, is there anything you'd like to add from this data perspective from and how FEMA or Cal OES learn about what we've experienced?
I guess I will just say from my experience working for the state, after the wildfires, many different years, we're always trying to predict and model where the potential mud flows were going to occur. And that's very difficult because, it depends on the heat of the fire resulting in the hydrophobicity of the soil. And then you have to predict how much rain will fall in what period of time, thus resulting in a, instability of a particular area. And I think one of the difficulties that was observed is in the Montecito mud flow, there were repeated warnings that, a mudslide was going to happen. And that had happened even, before and after that devastating mudslide happened. And so, I think one of the difficulties is and probably Michael and Stephen can speak to this better, but evacuation fatigue too. Where we're sending out a warning, something may happen, but it's so difficult to predict from the science side that we don't know if it's going to happen. And at some point, people don't evacuate and then they're put in harm's way. So I think that's something that is difficult to address and figure out, when is the appropriate time to alert people, because you don't want to get the call wrong and not have sent out the alert.
And I do want to have Michael and Stephen weigh in if they like on that. But before I do, Nicole, can you say, given that's such a critical piece, there's so much information embedded in that. Are we tracking that? Are we learning from it? Are we studying what works and what doesn't?
I will say from, the state FEMA perspective, where we bring in all the different state and federal agencies to map out these potential areas. Yes, there is something they are aware of. For example, if you're setting up a housing mission after, a devastating wildfire has destroyed many homes, you want to ensure that you're not setting up these housing solutions in an area that's vulnerable to mudslide. So it is being mapped, but again, it is something that is difficult to predict because of all of the various components within, the mudslide equation. That being said, it's a great place for researchers to focus to help us identify if there are triggers that would enable us to, have a better, clearer picture of when and if something is going to happen.
Michael or Stephen, anything you'd like to add?
Sure. I think what Nicole was mentioning about this sort of disaster fatigue and in the communities and regions that I've worked with, that's definitely a sentiment that many individuals from local government officials to advocates to the affected population that are experiencing, and this constant sense of trauma. These are multiple years of disaster, and every time the wind changes or it gets hot and the drought, a lack of rain, people are on constant high alert. So there's a definite sense of disaster fatigue. And what I learned recently too, a sense of resilience fatigue. So oftentimes there's been a movement of, trying governments at all levels is using this concept of resilience and sort of putting all the efforts for disaster planning and outreach, community outreach, on NGOs and nonprofits and advocates and community groups. And these individuals have told me that they essentially want local government to step up, to include them, but to step up and take leadership and make sure that adequate, sufficient funds are allocated to these communities, and not putting on the backs of under-resourced already NGOs. I'm not saying not to collaborate on projects, but oftentimes when we see the resilience framework is that a lot of it's put on, the onerous is put on these community groups. So that's something I've learned recently of this resilience fatigue.
Yeah, I want to agree with both Nicole and Michael on this. And I also want to just add that it's really important that if we do kind of move towards more robust evacuation planning as well as resilience planning, including that response mechanism, is that there has to be funds and there has to be staff and there has to be resources for that at the local level. Locals are already overwhelmed in disasters and are already spread very thin, especially coming out of COVID-19 when we've been really in an emergency state for 16 months. And so it's really important that these funds and resources are provided if evacuation planning is to be made into more robust policy. We cannot say to the locals that they should just do it on their own. There needs to be a clear and sustainable funding mechanism for that.
Really excellent points. I have a question here from Alistair Hayden, who is a current CCST fellow placed at the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, and it pertains to the conversation we were just having about data. And he asks, he wants to know about what data can be used, what data is still needed to incorporate social vulnerability, not just geographic vulnerability, into response and recovery. Michael, you want to start?
Sure. So the state has sort of bare bones social vulnerability maps. They're just PDFs. It's not interactive. It's not similar to our kind of first class, nationally world-renowned known California environmental health screening tool. So that science-based data tool to identify disadvantaged environmental justice communities that the state uses for planning and other type of environmental resources and funding, we don't have an equivalent for disaster and social vulnerability that's robust and identifies some of these stigmatized populations. For example, there's a great study that the University of Washington did, one of the first that looked at how low-income and people of color census tracts are disproportionately affected by wildfires and have potential for wildfire hazard vulnerability. And it was a cutting-edge study, but it essentially whitewashes out all undocumented immigrant regions. So it shows Santa Barbara, Ventura County, parts of Sonoma having low levels of social vulnerability, because generally in those counties, there's a preponderance of high income groups. So factoring that in of how do we identify these hundreds of thousands of individuals that are in high cost, high income, economically secure areas that are getting essentially whitewashed out of the data. So I think Cal EnviroScreen originally started with environmental justice groups and academics such as Manuel Pastor at USC and Rachel Morello-Frosch at UC Berkeley. And they essentially worked and ground truth that sort of data and scientific tool, and the state eventually adopted it, were pressured to adopt it through legislation. And so we need something like that for disaster social vulnerability mapping.
I think to also add in is that's really critical, is to have that tool that better shows that social vulnerability. I also think it's important to be collecting data on the ground, like Michael is doing in Sonoma right now, talking with communities, conducting qualitative interviewing or focus groups. A lot of my research is based on survey data. And so actually getting information directly from people who have been impacted by disasters is really critical. It helps ground truth what's happening and including our models as well as our planning. And so some of the data needs also can be sometimes very difficult and costly and takes a lot of time, but it helps shape the narrative. It helps tell the story that needs to be told in these communities. And I think that's really important, along with still kind of big data, which has its uses, but it's kind of a combination of both to be able to really parse out the needs of communities as well as the social vulnerability.
Great, thank you. Nicole, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think those are both really great points that Michael and Stephen had. And, from a federal perspective, when we started just funding billions of dollars of vaccination projects, the initial goal was to okay, let's get the infrastructure in place because we need to vaccinate as many people as possible. And as we have met these milestones, the next goal is to really transition our focus to enable us to target these resources to under-resourced and underserved communities. And so I think that is how we're kind of pivoting to, not that we haven't been doing this, but there's definitely a focus on that now. So hopefully we can continue on that track.
Well, go ahead, Michael.
And I also think that as we do these, going back to our theme of compounding disasters, it's also when we're collecting this data, really taking frameworks from the field of public health, such as this idea of syndemic, which is a set of linked health problems involving two or more afflictions, interacting synergetically and contributing to excess burden of disease and various population groups. So these endemics, we can see this happening between people from the environmental justice perspective, people out working in the fields or living next to freeways and factories that are emitting hazardous toxic emissions that people are breathing for years and generations, that makes them have respiratory diseases such as like asthma, cancer, and other types of afflictions that compromise their immune systems. And when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, that again interacts synergetically and makes them more vulnerable if they contract COVID-19 pandemic and more likely to get hospitalized or even face death. So understanding sort of these syndemics, these compoundings of disaster, and how, again, disasters only exacerbate existing inequalities or environmental injustices that these populations are experiencing.
Syndemics, one of our words of the day, along with hydrophobicity, Nicole. I caught that. Michael, this is a question to you from the audience. This is from Margaret Arachiga, and you're working in Sonoma. She would like to know, has there been any specific work done in the Central Valley that you're aware of?
In terms of wildfires?
In terms of, we'll say syndemics.
Well, I think there's a lot of great research and community groups that are working on the COVID-19 pandemic. Wildfires, fortunately, haven't been as a major issue as it is throughout the Central Coast in Northern California and Southern California, the coastal areas, essentially. But in San Joaquin Valley, I know there's some great research that people are doing out of UC Merced that's looking at the effects of COVID-19 pandemics on some of these migrant communities and how that's intersecting with existing air qualities. And I'd like to mention that I was just received the National Science Foundation grant to work with NCAR, which is the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And we're going to be piloting late this summer, a 2-year study that looks at the air quality impacts to undocumented migrants laboring in these wildfire events. So doing air quality and health modeling of what potentially are the health effects, not just from particulate matter, but these wildfires are essentially toxic soup that multiple chemicals and emissions are being emitted into the air, and how is that affecting people's health?
Michael, this is a follow-on question related to some terminology that you just referenced. This is from Mimi Olson. She says, I notice you say migrant workers as opposed to immigrant workers. Is there an understanding that they move around California or return to their country of origin?
Yeah. So that's an intentional choice, obviously, that I'm using. In the published article, I first used immigrant because we were really reaching an international audience. But as I move forward with this, I think migrants really acknowledges that these individuals have been living in our communities, in our state for decades. And yes, they may move slightly between regions, but their home is California. And also from an indigenous migrant perspective, it acknowledges that they're indigenous to the Americas and that they're not immigrants. So this looks at acknowledging that these are long-term individuals that are living in our state. And second is acknowledging, particularly for indigenous migrants, that they're indigenous to the Americas.
Excellent, thank you. Nicole, can you talk a little bit about your work to get ahead of these disasters? So we're not just responding, we're preparing for. And this is going to be probably our last question before we do wrap up, because we're almost at the end.
Sure. So Michael, I hear you on the resiliency fatigue, but it's still one of my favorite topics. I do think, we can learn a lot from disasters. And one of the things I think that we need to focus on is and enabling communities to be more resilient. And that would, come along with federal and state dollars, but with these projects coming from the local level to really address a lot of the risks that we're facing. And I think, looking forward, they should be multi-hazard if they can. So an example of this is after a flood, FEMA will, for public buildings, let's say FEMA will, fund a building to be elevated if that first floor had critical equipment on it that was destroyed. And so that first floor now would be like a parking garage. So for example, if that building was in an earthquake prone zone, a forward thinking thing to do would be like, well, we're elevating this building, so let's, mitigate it against future earthquakes as well. So I think really focusing on multi-hazard as well as continuing to look at innovative ways that we can really address these difficult issues. Wildfire mitigation is incredibly complex and incredibly difficult. It is not as predictable, for example, as a flood. There are places where there are repeated burn scars. So Coffey Park, for example, had an identical burn scar to a fire in the 70s called the Henley Fire. And so, what can we do in that community to make it more resilient to that disaster, but also look forward and say, okay, if we're doing fire mitigation, can we do something collaborative with flood mitigation as well? So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I want to ask a wrap-up question to the three of you, and then I'll close by just repeating some of the high-level takeaways that I heard today. Can you talk about, because disasters affect us as people, can you talk about what some actions that each of us can take personally to be a part of the solution? And Stephen, I'll start with you first.
Yeah, I think the first thing you need to be doing is you need to be individually prepared as a family, have a go bag, have an emergency evacuation plan, but one that's not just, of course, focused on one disaster. That can be multiple different types of disasters, including something that could be a compounding issue. What if you do lose electricity? How then do you evacuate? Are you able to get out of your garage, for example? Do certain house functions allow you to evacuate? And that's kind of a first thing that everyone can do, and understand that the risks are pretty high everywhere. And then you also need to be just thinking of all the unknown unknowns. That's kind of when it comes to disasters, we have to start thinking in that way. We're not going to know everything, but we have to start thinking in that manner. So I think that's the primary thing I would suggest that people do on their own. I think it's a really great tool and mechanism to be able to prepare oneself. And then kind of as a side to that, also providing talk to your neighbor and ask if they need assistance in an evacuation. Determine if they need help, if they have a car, if they might need some assistance getting to their car. In those types of situations, you may be the only person that is able to assist them. And it's really critical that we look out for each other in these times and to be able to provide those resources to each other.
Thank you, wise. Michael, I'll have you go next, and Nicole, you get the last wrap-up word.
Great, thank you again for this opportunity. I really thoroughly enjoyed the conversation to meet Stephen, Nicole, and of course, Amber. I would say, of course, that individual perspective is very important to have the to-go bags or the go-ready bags. But that backpack is not the only thing that we can do. That a lot of these disasters that are happening in California has had a long history of disaster. It's part of sort of our cultural identity. And many of these disasters, because of climate change, we know are predictable, that we're going to have them. Drought, heat waves, poor air quality, and wildfires, of course, earthquakes. And many of these disasters can be preventable in terms of the impacts. So it's going to take larger structural change, and individuals, from the individual taxpayer and voter to community groups, and demanding that elected officials from the local, state, and federal level have more culturally sensitive and appropriate type of disaster planning that focuses specifically on the most marginalized communities. Because if you look at many of these plans, even in a region that has hit by extreme wildfire disasters, these issues of social vulnerability are done in a very casual manner. It's very discussed in many of these policy documents. So ensuring that there's robust, comprehensive discussion and implementation on social vulnerability, resilience networks as well.
Great,
So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Nicole?
I'll make mine short. From a public health perspective, although I am not public health, get vaccinated.
All right, I love that. Wonderful. Thank you all. That was an amazing amount of information in a short amount of time. I heard that all disasters are local. We need to be paying attention at the local level, that these communities that are higher risk for one type of disaster are probably higher risk for others. The communities are the places that we need to invest, the community groups, the local entities, and they need to be well coordinated with the state and federal entities. The data is so important for us to learn from these disasters and apply it to future disasters, that we can get out ahead of these. We can think about multiple disasters at once. There's so much more to do in this space. It really feels like an emerging area. I'm so grateful for all three of you digging into this topic, for your time today, for your future work in this. I'm grateful for all the participants, for the questions that came in, and I'm grateful for our CCST staff who make this possible. So thanks to all of you, and enjoy the rest of your day.